We welcome you to the next session of this exciting conference, and I'm certain that this session will be up to the standard of the previous sessions, which is a very high standard. It's exciting to be gathered once more in the Religious Freedom Annual Review in person. My name is Gary Doxey. I am an Associate Director of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies at Brigham Young University. And I have been to all of the Religious Freedom Annual Reviews. In fact, it was sort of, I was in the session where we were just brainstorming, what could we do like this? So I feel like, in a way, I'm one of the founders of this exciting conference. And it is terrific to be with all of you. This session is a continuation of the track that deals with repairers of the breach, religion making a difference. Our specific theme this time is welcoming the stranger. And today we have as speakers Christina Tobias-Nahi of Islamic Relief USA. She's the Director of Public Affairs, Research, and Advocacy. We have partnered as a center with Islamic Relief USA a number of times, and we have asked a lot of Christina, especially in the last couple of weeks. We've had her running about, being on panels at different conferences that we've held. We're grateful for her participation and for her friendship above all. Thank you, Christina, for being with us. Chelsey J. Johnson is a network organizer for Lutheran Immigration and Refugees Service. Immigration and refugee are two terms that come to mind today as some of the most important in our national and international discussion. We're excited to hear from Chelsey and hope that we can learn a lot from her about what's going on and also how faith makes a difference in welcoming the stranger. Finally, we have Wade Cusack, who is from LINK. That's a very interesting acronym for the purposes of our subject matter, LINK, which stands for Love Your Neighbor Community, an equally interesting and very important term in the subject matter that we're talking about today. Wade has also been a partner with the International Center for Law and Religion Studies. He is originally from Belarus, and he is actively working, particularly in Central Asia, but in the former Soviet space more generally, which is the area geographically where our center first got its start. And so we've been working with Wade on religion and the rule of law training seminars, which give certificates to participants. And we're so grateful to have Wade with us here today. Just recently, our center was in a conference with him in Uzbekistan. So he's another one we've sort of demanded that he travel around to help us, and we're grateful for his participation. Without further ado, we'll go in the order announced, and we'll hear presentations. We hope that at the end we'll have some time for some exchange with the audience as well as with each other, and thank you for your attention.
Good afternoon to those in the room and those online. I actually came up here wearing a mask as a protest, but not for what you might think. It was not political. It was not science skepticism even. But it was actually to illustrate a story before we begin. Our topic today is on refugees. This beautiful mask, two-sided, decorative, was made by a group of refugees in the Virginia area. It was a group called the Refugee Mask Maker Association, and it was a group that formed in the first weeks after the onset of the pandemic. Because here was a health crisis. We went to pharmacies. We couldn't find face coverings at that time. And there was a need. And there was a group of women, refugees, who had little English, maybe little skills that they had brought with them, but they knew some skills like sewing, and they were able to form this cooperative group, and people donated the fabrics, and Here was a need that was filled. So when we often talk about refugees or hear refugees in the media, they're malaligned, and we hear about how they're taking our jobs, or they're coming in unskilled. But I just want you to think about this beautiful story, because they served this need at this time when the rest of us were suffering and didn't know where to get our supplies, and they were there sewing these and distributing these to our communities. So just a little story to start. So my name is Christina. I'm with Islamic Relief Usa. We're part of the Federation of the Islamic Relief Family, which is, for those who may not know it, the largest Muslim faith-based organization in the world, serving in about 40 countries where we have permanent presence, and then always in many countries where we're responding as first responders to disasters. So we're a bit all over the place all the time, and we do a lot. We were actually founded about 40 years ago in the UK by some doctors in response to the Africa famine and food crisis, and so we're very much in that space as one of our priority areas in a lot of countries in the world. We work with the UN World Food Program, for example. However, today's topic is about refugees. So I want to just throw out what we call kind of the scourges of this time, and I'm actually going to take my water. So the scourge of this time that we're living in right now, we call it the 3 C's, which is COVID, which I've just spoken about, which is climate change, and which is conflict. And in fact, for those who are interested in the peace work, and I know a lot of you here are, the Global Peace Index just came out just a number of weeks ago. This comes out annually. And indeed, since 2014, as we certainly expect and from what we see in the news and around us, peace around the world is declining across many countries and many contexts. And that is one driver for flows of refugees. Now, Monday, many of you probably know, is World Refugee Day. It was renamed. It used to be called Africa Refugee Day initially, and it was started in 2001. And that was 50 years in recognition of, the legal definition of refugees and the Convention on Refugees. So I want to actually, because I know there's some lawyers in the room, speak about what that legal definition is, and then I want to talk about some of our work, what we're doing both internationally and here in the U.S. So the legal definition of a refugee, for those who might be unaware, and why this is important, is someone who is unwilling or unable to return to their country of origin, owing to a well-founded fear, and that needs to be proven and documented, of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, or member of a particular social group or political opinion. The numbers of refugees in the world right now is at the highest that it has ever been post-World War II. In fact, the United Nations High Commission on Refugees just updated their numbers a number of weeks ago. And we are at over 102 million refugees in the world. I'm just going to repeat that number so you can let that sink in. 102 million refugees. And those are just the ones that have been counted. Now, again, that definition is very specific and very legal. We're not talking today on this panel particularly about internally displaced people who have been forcibly relocated because of conflict or climate or economics and are still within the boundaries and the confines of their countries and don't have the same access and benefits of refugees. But that number is so vast, and working in an international humanitarian development and advocacy organization such as mine, we've been advised by groups that do research, such as the Gates Foundation, that people can't wrap their mind around numbers like that, and you really need to personalize it. So I'm going to tell a personal story about a refugee that I met. And this refugee was a young man. He was of Hazara ethnicity, so that's in Afghanistan. They're also persecuted because they are of South Asian ancestry, Genghis Khan descendants, and they've been persecuted within the Afghan society. And his brother had left a number of years ago and was able to get out and get to Europe before things got as bad as they are now. And this is, again, pre this big evacuation last summer. So when things got especially tense, and he feared for the safety of his family, his brother had left behind a wife and young children. He took it upon himself as a young man, not even yet 20, to get his wife, his sister-in-law, so his brother's wife and her young children out of the country. And he walked with them out of Afghanistan, through Iran, across Turkey. They took a boat, and I met them in Lesvos, Greece. We have a program there that's a pro bono legal clinic. And what's fascinating about this is it's Islamic Relief and HIAS. HIAS is the Hebrew Aid and Immigration Society, a Jewish volunteer refugee resettlement agency here in the US, and the oldest. And we work with them quite a bit. And so, amazingly, this program, not only that it does this type of work that takes in these people and works on their cases, but also changes that narrative of Muslims and Jews can't work together. Here we are, a Muslim and Jewish organization, putting our resources, our staff, our talent into this. And our staff on the ground are actually Greek Orthodox. So the beauty of that program. This particular individual, they got there safely. He protected this woman and her children. He now works for us as a translator, and she was, through legal access aid, able to get to her husband, her spouse in Germany. And so that is a happy story. So I like to share the happy stories. They're not all happy. Similarly, next week, being that it is World Refugee Day, we have a conference with HIAS in Geneva, and it's aptly called Welcoming the Stranger. So we're bringing together UN entities, practitioners from around the globe. So it's a Islamic Relief worldwide, HIAS, and Lutheran World Federation joint conference. So again, just showcasing the type of work that we can do together as faith communities. When the issues are so large, it takes all of us coming together to find the solutions. So I want to talk about, for those of you who are just in the room, on genocide. I just heard the case of Rwanda. So one of the things that we've been working on the periphery of the actual legal aid cases is looking at case law and trying to make changes legislatively, both in Parliament and Europe and here in the United States. So many of you may have followed just this week the kind of overturn of what the UK was trying to do. On Tuesday of this week, the European Court of Human Rights actually did not allow the deportation of immigrants into the UK. There was a transactional relationship that was happening. So those who were coming into the UK, whether through these routes that I've talked about, through Lesvos and up through Europe and then crossing from Calais, France, into the UK, if they were not able to prove this fear of persecution, they cannot legally send them back to their countries of origin. So they had this transactional relationship with Rwanda that they were going to put them on planes and deport them there. This is now pending, as it has been kind of overturned for the moment. But it's not just Europe. Also this week here in the United States, on Monday, same week, Supreme Court just made a ruling, and you can see it online, that the federal government can detain for more than 6 months immigrants crossing our borders as their cases are being reviewed. So this is the state of the world that we're looking at right now. They can. It was a young man from Mexico, I believe, who had brought the case because he had been detained for a number of months without his case even being reviewed. So quickly, because I know we have limited time, I just want to talk a little bit about the work we are doing here in the United States. So here in the United States, we're working with the VOLAGs, or the Refugee Resettlement Agencies, as a partner. Currently, there are 9 agencies, correct? Not one of which is Muslim, although more than 50% of refugees in the world are Muslim. So they are Christian, Jewish, as I mentioned, of more secular, but realizing in the particular case of what happened last summer and the inflow of the Afghan refugees, that there needed to be some cultural and religious competency, and we kind of stepped in with a number of the agencies to help fulfill that role. We always work on programs that are protecting women and children. They're very vulnerable. As I gave that illustration of that young man who accompanied his sister-in-law, we're seeing that with Ukraine, right? So it's often the women and the children who are the most vulnerable. We do a lot of livelihood programs, so helping them when they get here to be able to kind of settle in and be able to self-sustain themselves. One example, we have a sewing program in the Virginia area that we just had a graduation last week. We have cohorts every couple of months where the women come, again, using sewing skills. They learn more professional sewing skills for tailoring and upholstery, and then at the end of their program, we gift them during the graduation ceremony with a sewing machine so they can start their own business. And that's a home-based business, again, while they're getting their language skills, or if they have small children at home, they can do this home-based. Just an example. We do a lot of education programs. Overseas, we have a program we like to call the Magic School Bus, which is kind of a play on that show here, for those who are familiar, that actually, because during COVID, so many education programs were interrupted, we would go to the camps where the refugee children were. We would pick them up, and the bus itself was kind of high-tech and decked out and had Wi-Fi, and they would do school on the bus, and then we would bring them back. Health clinics, both internationally and in the U.S., especially because of the scourge of COVID and the lingering effects of that. A lot of free clinics, mental health work. We stay true to our origins, which is food and food insecurity, so a lot of feeding programs, especially during the Muslim holidays. We make sure that they're able to celebrate. I should say, which I forgot at the outset, we, despite our name being Islamic Relief, we serve all populations and all vulnerable people across the world. We've been in Haiti, we've been in Nepal, so it is regardless of religion. And just in closing, I want to, and one last thing we did in the U.S., actually. Many people don't know that a lot of those children that got airlifted out and the youth on those first initial planes were separated from their families. And in that kind of chaos, many, many children ended up in the shelters in the U.S. The shelter system that normally houses the South America border crossing children and migrants as they're trying to get family placements. And there was no religious or linguistic competency in those shelters to deal with these children, so we were also advising on that. So we have just some publications. So in terms of the advocacy work, so that's the programmatic work. We like to link that with our advocacy. We do a lot of publications and booklets. Many of them are available on our website. I was looking at this old one, actually, which was something we had produced for the UN Refugee Summit a number of years ago, and it lists that there were 20 million refugees in the world. I can't find a date on this, but now we're over 100 million. And one of the things we do, which I think this audience in particular will appreciate when we do these types of literature, is we always put scripture here. So we've got scripture both on the rights of the migrants and the refugees themselves. Also, what are the duties of the hosting communities? And some of this is a call out to some of the countries, the Gulf specifically, and some of those, rich countries that are in neighboring states that have not taken in their fair share of refugees. So we remind them religiously, why they should be doing so. And so I'll just kind of read one of these in closing. So we have, the Quran calls on humankind to fulfill the role of protectors and helpers to all oppressed men, women, and children who cry out, Lord, rescue us from this town where people are oppressors. And promises, and there's a verse there, and promises that those escaping persecution will find, again a verse, many a refuge and a great plenty in the earth. So we have this kind of scripture in the work we do. We had one that's much more extensive. I wasn't able to download the whole thing, but I'm happy to share with the link with people, that actually goes into the right of protection, the right to non-refoulement, so why they should not be returned to those countries of origin if there's persecution or crisis or conflict, the right to dignity, the right to non-discrimination in their hosting countries, the right to freedom of religion. We have a whole section on that. The right to having their physical, spiritual needs met, Just it goes into a lot of those rights that are inherent in Islamic law and jurisprudence, all the way, set all the way back from the time of the Ottomans. So, I will just say, again, just to bring a story back to it, I have had the personal experience working in Washington, D.C. to work frequently with our Muslim congresswomen, both Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar. And whatever you think about their politics, we're not going to talk about that here. But I would commend you to read a book by Ilhan Omar that's recently come out. It's an autobiography called This Is What America Looks Like, where she captures beautifully her story as a refugee herself, being resettled in the U.S., that experience for her family, getting into civil society, the allowance that her community, a little bit, not so much in the beginning, but they came to appreciate her skills and her outspokenness, her community and the opportunity that education in the U.S. provided her, her work at the state legislature, all the way to arriving to be a member of Congress today. So again, just kind of where I started, they are not here stealing our jobs. They're not here, creating more fitna, which is an Islamic word, like chaos in our communities. They have a lot of offerings and skills and beauty to bring, and we need to all be appreciative of that and see what we can do. And I hope if we have time at the end, I know there's opportunities of call to action, things that you can do. One thing you can do, we're trying to pass the Afghan Adjustment Act. There's a lot of advocacy around that. A lot of coalitions and faith groups are working on. Those who have arrived from Afghanistan don't have a pathway to citizenship because they did not arrive as regular refugees. So we're trying to push Congress to adjust their status. So I'm happy to talk more about that. Thank you.
WWJD. What would Jesus do? For Christians and non-Christians alike, this phrase may sound familiar, and it may evoke the image of a particular bracelet. Raise your hand if you've ever owned or seen a WWJD bracelet. Maybe you've seen it on a billboard or on a t-shirt. This phrase was originally penned in 1897, but rose to popularity 100 years later in the 1990s to serve as a reminder for followers of Jesus that we are called to act in a way that embodies Christ's love in the world, that we are called to respond to the world around us in the way of Jesus. What would Jesus do? This same question is at the core of the work and ministry of Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. My name is Chelsey Johnson, and I have the absolute honor of serving at Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, or LIRS. LIRS is the largest national faith-based nonprofit dedicated to serving immigrants and refugees. For the last 80 years, LIRS has worked to protect those fleeing persecution, welcoming more than 500,000 immigrants and refugees into the United States. We got our start in 1939 during the Second World War, when we were assisting in the resettlement of Lutherans who were fleeing persecution under the Nazi regime. But as the way of the world goes, we soon saw others in need. Not just Lutherans, but others who were being persecuted and seeking safety, being displaced from their homes. And so we welcomed them, not because they were Lutheran, but because we are. And as Lutherans, we are called by our sacred texts, by our gospel, by our God, to care for the poor and oppressed, and to welcome the stranger. And so we've done that. In the 1950s, we were welcoming refugees from Cuba. In the 70s, Vietnamese and other refugees from Southeast Asia. Bosnians in the 90s. In the early 2000s, the lost boys and girls from Sudan. And in every crisis since, LIRS has played a part in welcoming our most vulnerable new neighbors. Today, our work is focused on 3 primary areas of work: refugee resettlement and integration, caring for immigrant children and families, and walking alongside asylum seekers here in the US. In terms of refugee resettlement, LIRS is one of 9 national resettlement agencies who works with the Office of Refugee Resettlement through the US Department of Health and Human Services. LIRS has the 2nd largest national resettlement network, and we are the largest faith-based nonprofit in the immigration and refugee space. We at LIRS see refugee resettlement not only as the first 90 days of case management when a refugee arrives in the US, but at LIRS we practice the long welcome, meaning that we are walking alongside these refugee families as they are in their communities and building their lives here in the US. That means that we're there to greet them at the airport when they arrive. We work with local volunteers to secure affordable housing, which, as you can imagine, is not an easy thing to do, particularly right now. We then furnish that house. We stock the refrigerator with culturally familiar foods to try to make those first few days and weeks a little easier. And then we continue walking alongside those families, offering career and education support for refugees who have recently arrived in the US or been here for decades, so that they can pursue their passions, so that they can use their gifts and education they maybe arrived in the US with, and so that they, as we so often hear, can be of service to their new communities. LIRS is also a leader nationally in caring for immigrant children. During the 2018 family separation crisis, LIRS was one of 2 organizations entrusted by the US government to reunite migrant children with their families. We work to provide community-based services and case management for these kiddos, providing short-term and longer-term foster care, and providing some of the logistical support so that these families can be reunified. That once a guardian is identified, we provide home studies, background checks, fingerprinting, all of that to make sure these kids are in safe custody. And then we ensure that we connect those families to local services that they may need as they are living their lives together. One of our other core areas of work where we are seeing particular growth right now is in our asylum services field. We provide care and services to asylum seekers both at the US border and those who have been recently released from immigration detention. Things like food, clothing, emergency medical care, and know your rights counseling. We're also innovating in this space through a new LIRS initiative called the Welcome Center, which serves as a one-stop shop for asylum seekers in their new communities to receive career guidance, mental health screening and support, legal services, connections to food banks, and local faith communities. And I'm grateful to share with you all that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has been a pivotal partner in that work for LIRS, funding our welcome centers in Seattle and in Portland, Oregon. And so we thank those of you, members of the church in the room, for that partnership. In recent months, these 3 core areas of work, refugee resettlement, children and family services, and asylum services, have brought us to the front lines of responding to some of the global migration crises that we have seen. In the last year, that has meant that we were providing services for the hundreds of unaccompanied kids who were arriving alone in the US in the spring of 2021. We were at months before the fall of Kabul, LIRS was leading the advocacy efforts to evacuate Afghans from Afghanistan, and in the months since have been involved in the resettlement of Afghans. Continuing to this day, we are still putting energy and time into those relationships and ensuring that our Afghan siblings are set up for success and are cared for here in the US. And we are also serving Ukrainians who are seeking safety, particularly those who are among the 20,000 who entered the United States through the circuitous route of Mexico and came into the US under humanitarian parole, meaning that they do not qualify for very many federal services, and so LIRS is trying to fill in the gaps as best we can for those Ukrainians who are arriving. As you can imagine, our hands are only a little full. But truly, this would not be possible without the leadership and generosity and service of faith communities across the US. Lutheran congregations, yes, but also mosques and synagogues and temples, and even universities and Lions clubs and yoga studios who have reached out to us, called by their faith and their values to provide care and support to our newest neighbors. LIRS not only walks alongside our immigrant and refugee friends, but we also walk alongside those community partners, equipping and preparing them to be ready to welcome the stranger. From providing scripture resources to community advocacy opportunities, trainings and webinars and opportunities to connect with other groups doing this work across the US, educational resources and volunteer opportunities. We are in the work of not only transforming lives, but transforming communities. We believe that our work is not only life-saving, but that it is game-changing, not just for our refugee and immigrant friends, but for the communities that they call home. From my 10,000-foot view of the national interconnecting network of LIRS, our community of supporters, congregations, donors, advocates, and volunteers, I am amazed and inspired by the ways people of faith and goodwill engage in this work. In just the last year, in responding to those major crises, when headlines were reading again and again about hundreds of kids being shipped to convention centers in Dallas and San Diego and across the US, LIRS was receiving thousands of emails and phone calls a day of families offering their homes as foster homes for those kiddos. Last fall, at the height of the Afghan evacuation crisis, more than 60,000 individuals clicked the volunteer form on LIRS, sharing their contact information and their desire to put their hands and their heart in this work. And from all 50 states, we see people responding, advocating for more just immigration policies and protections, donating to provide direct emergency support to families in need, joining our calls for prayer and interfaith vigils, lifting up the needs of our displaced global family, and in taking the time to simply learn more about the realities facing our immigrant and refugee friends here in the United States. It is this widespread outpouring of support that makes it possible for us to welcome immigrants and refugees, to provide them the long welcome, and to support them as they rebuild their lives, provide for their families, practice their own religious freedoms, and make our nation stronger. LIRS got our start asking the question, what would Jesus do? But we look to the future, propelled by the question, what can we do together? Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me here and allowed me to share some experience that our organization went through in connection with Ukrainian crisis, with the recent war that broke up in February, and how religious freedom impacted the refugee crisis. So on February 24th, the world watched as Russia invaded its neighboring country, Ukraine. Missiles, airstrikes, strike villages, towns, and cities across Ukraine, including the capital Kyiv. Just hours later, the Russian military launched a large ground invasion from multiple directions. The impact was devastating to see on the news and even more devastating to those who experienced that. A group of Indian students, both Muslims and Christians, were estranged in Kharkiv. This is one of the Ukrainian's largest city, located on the north from Ukraine, very close to Russian border, and its city had been heavily shelled during the war's early days. I became acquainted with this group through common friends and began receiving messages and phone calls. The student pleaded for evacuation help. And since the first Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014, our organization has had 2 humanitarian sites in eastern Ukraine. We also have friends all over the country. And yes, we could help those Indian students. But organizing evacuation for these students presented a moral dilemma, personally for me, because I was safe in my home in Miami, and I'm going to ask my Ukrainian friends to put their own lives in danger to help others who were in danger. Millions of Ukrainians started hitting the border with European Union, and at the same time, hundreds of faith-based organizations operating in Ukraine decided to stay. And they acted upon what they deeply believe: faith and work. Since February 25th, the day after Russian invasion started, evacuation routes, call centers, and safe havens were immediately mobilized by churches and other faith-based organizations in Ukraine. At the same time, religious communities in nearby countries such as Poland, Romania, Slovakia transformed their places of worship and other facilities into the refugee camps. Germany and other Western European countries were following. More than 4 million Ukrainians, mostly of them women and children, crossed the border seeking refuge within the first months of the war, even within the first 3 weeks of the war. 4 million in 3 weeks, it's a pretty large number. Despite the enormous strain on Europeans' infrastructure, incidents of people sleeping on the streets because they had nowhere place to go were rare, and those that did occur were quickly resolved. Religious freedom is one of the major factors that contributed into ability of those countries, including Ukraine, to provide first aid, to accommodate, and to help so many refugees. Religious freedom helps save lives in the time of disaster. It entails more than just the right to worship at the designated location. It is the right to live according with one's conscience in both everyday life and during disaster. We saw this firsthand in 2014 when our organization conducted peacemaking seminars for Russians and Ukrainians, for leaders, religious leaders, after first invasion. We held our seminars next to the demarcation line in eastern Ukraine, where local people suffered the most because of the war. At some point, one of the participants said, I understand that our organization, our church, should not side it with neither sides, and we should not run from this conflict. He said, I understand that position of the Christian church in this conflict, and the church supposed to present a third force, a force that brings aid, healing, restoration, and reconciliation for those who suffer and affected by war. But to be able to carry out all these things, the church and any other faith-based organizations with similar values needs religious freedom. Many countries in today's world, unfortunately, are attempting to control, manipulate, and restrict religious freedom. As a result of such practices, religious communities, particularly minorities, are unable to assist the country's most vulnerable citizens. I personally know of incidents where people of faith were detained and later charged with illegal religious activity, which included the distribution of food packages to malnourished families during the recent pandemic. Who knows how many people didn't receive timely aid, suffered mentally and physically, became depressed, or went through the divorce because of these policies. The book of Proverbs in the Bible states, rescue those who are being taken away to death, hold back those who are stumbling to the slaughter. Jesus motivated his church with the following words: "For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me." The majority of religions motivates their followers to practice compassion. But how they can practice it without religious freedom? Those of us who live in freedom, and it's maybe such an incidence of being arrested for distributing food, it's irrelevant for the United States, but we should understand and the responsibilities to preserve and build a religious freedom in our country and all over the world. Our organization's Ukraine staff refocused quickly when the war broke out, focusing on evacuation and establishing a refugee center in Bautzen, Germany. On February 25th, we had 5 volunteers working on the call center, taking rescue requests and providing information about safe routes and safe havens in Western Ukraine. We renovated old building in Lviv, which is Western Ukraine, and started to use it as a logistical center. Within the week, we had buses that transported refugees from safe havens to the border and from other side of the border to Germany. In Germany, local church building was turned into a refugee center that provided food, assistance and registration with the government, temporary place to live, trauma healing therapy, and even refugee-run hair salon. As of now, we have 1,800 people who came through our center in Bautzen, including 32 people from Mariupol, the city most severely damaged by Russians. I don't think any government structure would be able to react that quickly as our and other faith-based organizations did. Next day, we started evacuation. We didn't ask for any permission to conduct the activities in accordance with our conscience. That is why these 1,800 refugees under our care and hundreds of thousands more within the other faith-based organizations were saved. Now our main focus is in ministering to the refugees in trauma healing. And how does religion, freedom, and trauma healing correlate, right? It's a good question. So first, many people became more open to spirituality after experiencing great disaster in their lives. Individuals who turn to religion to cope with unbearable and unpredictable events in their lives. And it's not only our maybe personal experience, it's also confirmed by the 2019 wide Oxford-made studies. Religious freedom ensures that people going through such experience are able to choose religion in accordance with their conscience. Second, religious freedom necessitates plurality and social cohesion, as well as groups and individuals who are whole, trauma-free, and capable of engaging, respecting, protecting of others who look, worship, and vote differently. Concluding with continuing the story of Indian students, and they were saved under very extremely, very dangerous circumstances. Christian volunteers risked their lives in reaching them, assisting them in boarding the evacuation train in Kharkiv, bound to the safer part of Ukraine. The local church hosted both the Christian and Muslim students for a few days before they crossed the border with Poland and departed for India. Each step of their journey was aided by faith-based organizations that exercises religious freedom, allowing people to think, express, and act on what they deeply believe. Thank you.
We're grateful for our presenters, and I think above all we thank them for the efforts they make around the world. It's truly something I think all of us can join in, not only applauding but supporting and offering our faith, our prayers, our work as in these tremendous tasks. We have just a few minutes for some dialogue between the panelists and with the audience as well. But I'm going to take the prerogative as chair to start with a question. We were struck by the each of the wonderful presentations at just how difficult the challenges are. We're truly faced with big numbers. I think Christina said 102 legally defined, which is a narrow category, 102 million refugees today in the world, and numbers just updated. To give you an idea, I looked back through some of my notes. In 2016, the UN estimated that there were 21 million refugees, and that was at the height of what everybody thought was a seminal conflict in the Middle East and difficulties in Africa that had driven the number of refugees and displaced persons to above or equal to the number of refugees and displaced persons at the end of World War II, to give you some perspective. So 2016, we had huge things happening, numbers never before achieved, and look where we are a few years later, 8 years later, with the numbers. Those earlier numbers just are dwarfed by the current numbers. And so my question is this: as conflict and as difficulties and as refugee status and as displaced person status becomes normalized, how do we as people of faith and people of goodwill confront the reality that maybe it doesn't take center stage in the way it ought to take center stage, that these subjects are people are learning to live with them as opposed to combating them? So that's my question. Do we have a microphone that we can pass as well? Maybe we just pass it to those who would like to respond. How do you deal with something that no longer makes the headlines, or that makes the headlines so often that people don't pay attention?
I can offer some brief reflection to get us started, and then we'll quickly pass it off to my colleagues at the table. I actually think that when we see some of these stories first breaking, there is an incredible response, particularly in the US context from the American public. We see these things, we know that they are not right, that they are inconsistent with our ideals as Americans, and we feel called to do something. Many of us as people of faith feel called to do something about this. I think the challenge is, as you named, what happens when those stories leave the headlines? And I think that that's a challenge we're wrestling with in real time, right? How do we take 60,000 volunteers at the peak of the Afghan evacuation crisis, and now how many of them are opening their emails about filling out that background check form? How many of them are signing up to attend a volunteer orientation so that we can utilize, their generous offer of their time, talents, and treasure? That's something that we are challenged by. One of the ways that LIRS is working to invite people into this work is through our ADAPT model. And ADAPT is an acronym that stands for Act, Donate, Advocate, Pray, and Teach. And so in all of our resources, whether they are part of our regular program, like scheduled programming, or in response to a crisis, we offer those 5 ways for people to discern how they are called to respond in that particular moment. For many people, they might not feel comfortable with advocacy, but they can pray. They can pray about it, and they know that they are contributing and that they are being a part of this movement of welcome. For me as a person of faith, I see that there's some room, particularly as a Christian, some room for the Holy Spirit to do some heart transforming through the ADAPT model. But I think that it allows people to act within their comfort zone and maybe challenge themselves to step outside of their comfort zone, right? Maybe they have never made a donation to an immigration organization before, but they see some of the work that is being done and they feel compelled by that. So we try to harness it, but I do think that sometimes it is a diminishing source of energy. And if you figure that out, let me know, or copyright it or something. Yes, adapt, act, donate, advocate, pray, and teach.
Sure, I'll jump in as well. So in addition to the advocacy work we're doing in kind of what we call the political corridors of power up on Capitol Hill or in other capitals in the UK and parliaments in Canada and other places where we're always talking and sharing stories, we work a lot with the media. We try and make sure that these stories don't get displaced. I failed to mention when I was in Lesvos, Greece, right before COVID, the population that we were seeing there was mostly Afghanis and actually of different African origin. But that office was set up at the height of the Syrian exodus, right? And no one ever talks about that anymore. So we try and keep, these stories alive and in the headlines because, these populations are still very vulnerable. In terms of, working with, our faith community here in the U.S., I think like many faith communities, we're a younger one, we're less established, but that doesn't mean, and we have a lot of youth, and they're very active, but it doesn't mean they're not disillusioned in some of the same ways that a lot of our faith communities are with like structured religion. And so we really work with them to engage them in activities. Here in the U.S. across the nation, we have offices, and they can volunteer and pack food boxes to give to refugees or help at a health clinic. Or we do have some overseas trips as well. So really getting them active. And one of that is because we have a kind of a prophetic saying, and we kind of articulate it all the time, that the Prophet Muhammad said, so if you see a wrong in the world that needs to be righted, then you need to do something with your hands. But if you can't do something with your hands, at least you should use your tongue and you should speak out. But if you also are in a position where you can't speak out, then at least, feel it in your heart. And so we try and remind our youth of this.
I think while these situations with refugees on headline, it's an opportunity for people and organizations to get connected personally. And I think it's important. And what Chelsey just described, these 5 steps, and it's a great opportunity to get connected personally and to take responsibility for the particular issue in the life of those who cannot help themselves, do not have resource, or do not have an opportunity. And the more people would be personally connected to the pain of others, the more issues will be resolved, and also the more people will be healed, not only for those who need this healing, but those who will be connected to heal the others. So thank you.
We've got time for one question. We have, I'm sorry about that, because we began a little late, and we have a hard stop technically that was a couple of minutes ago. But we'll take one more question, and then I would urge you to keep talking during the lunch hour, and I'd urge our panelists also to answer your questions at that time as well. So we'll take one question here.
First, I want to say thank you. This session has been truly inspiring and deeply moving. After I get my lunch at Brick Oven, I'm ready to call it quits and go home and act. And that's saying a lot, because I love being here. But there's one word that Christina used in her remarks that has riveted my attention as I've been listening, and that is the word narrative. And I'm just wondering, the question has been revolving in my mind, but what have you learned in your individual work with your individual organizations? Any insights, anything, lessons, principles about how we can change cultural narratives to promote, strengthen, preserve religious freedom, and provide greater relief to welcoming the stranger?
Just in practicing what we do, we feel like we're living that change of narrative. Most of the time when you do see Muslims or Sikhs, as we heard in the earlier panel, in mainstream media, it's because there's been a terrorist attack or something. So just by getting out there and doing what we do, we respond to disasters here in the U.S. We're a national partner of the American Red Cross, and we have these, we're one of their largest partners, and we've got deployed teams that are trained to deploy, and we've got these co-branded vests, and so, you know, hurricane, a wildfire, an earthquake, the U.S. seems to have its fair share of disasters. And I just remember a number of years ago in Louisiana, there was some massive flooding. And this comes back to that story I think we heard this morning about solidarity as well. So we had a team deploy alongside the American Red Cross to do mud, I forget what it's called, mud mucking out, something where you go into the homes that have been flooded and you get the debris out. And we actually went into a community. So we have both things. We went into a community where actually the sheriff said, we cannot protect you here. This is like a gun carrying area and we've never met Muslims before. And the American Red Cross said, well, if you send our team out, the entire American Red Cross team is going to pull out. So that's just a sense of solidarity. But on the flip side of that, and that's very rare that something like that will happen, what we generally get is people saying we've never met a Muslim before. And thank you so much for coming to our community and helping out. So it really helps to change the narrative just by having those one-on-one personal experiences. So, yeah.
I'm afraid we're going to have to make a hard stop now, but thank you, and I hope the conversation can continue. Thank you to each of our panelists.